The quiet librarian outshot every Marine sniper in training. Nobody saw it coming, not even herself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The California sun beat down on Camp Pendleton as buses unloaded their civilian passengers. The base hummed with an unusual energy, Marines in their crisp uniforms standing at attention, while ordinary citizens from across America streamed through the gates for the Weekend Skills Exchange program. The initiative, designed to foster civilian-military relations, had attracted an eclectic mix of professionals eager to share their expertise while learning from the elite fighting force. Mara A. Whitlock stepped off the bus last, adjusting her oversized glasses with one hand while clutching a worn leather satchel with the other. Her faded cardigan hung loosely over a plain button-up shirt, and unlike the excited chatter surrounding her, she moved with quiet purpose. The simple name tag pinned to her chest, Mara A. Whitlock, Public Library, Boise, seemed almost apologetic in its ordinariness. "Welcome to Camp Pendleton," announced a sergeant with a booming voice that silenced the crowd. "You'll be assigned to your respective groups shortly." As the civilians gathered their belongings, Mara drifted to the periphery of the crowd. A high school football coach demonstrated throwing techniques to a circle of amused Marines. Nearby, a social media survivalist with thousands of followers live-streamed his arrival, while a welder from Detroit discussed metallurgy with an interested maintenance officer. No one paid attention to the librarian. Gunnery Sergeant Will Hartman surveyed the civilians with barely concealed skepticism. "Another PR stunt," he muttered to Corporal Jesse Liang, who stood beside him checking off names on a clipboard. "Civilians playing soldier for a weekend." "Yes, sir," Jesse replied, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Though some might surprise us." "Doubtful," Hartman scoffed, adjusting his cap. "Just make sure none of them break anything expensive." Mara's boots, unlike her otherwise unremarkable appearance, were impeccably maintained, military-grade and broken in with the care of someone who understood their importance. She observed the base with quiet assessment, noting exit points, distance markers, and the subtle hierarchy displayed in the Marines' interactions. Major Sierra Alvarez emerged from the command building, her authoritative presence immediately commanding respect. She welcomed the civilians with practiced diplomacy, emphasizing the program's importance while Marines distributed schedules and safety guidelines. Throughout the orientation, Mara remained unnoticed, a shadow among personalities. She absorbed information silently, offering only polite nods when addressed directly. The proud Marines, accustomed to respect and attention, barely registered her presence as they guided the civilians toward their first activities. Little did they know that the unassuming woman from Idaho would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about skill, precision, and the quiet power of those who choose to remain invisible. The sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton's firing range, transforming the California air into a shimmering mirage above the targets. Marine snipers lined up in their positions, a chorus of confident laughter and boastful predictions filling the space. Gunnery Sergeant Will Hartman paced behind them, occasionally barking corrections about form or wind calculations. $200 says I take the high score today," announced a burly Marine, slapping his rifle affectionately. His companions responded with good-natured jeers and counter-wagers. In their midst, Mara A. Whitlock stood quietly, almost invisible despite the open terrain. The librarian from Boise approached the range master with a polite nod, her oversized glasses sliding slightly down her nose. "May I borrow a standard-issue rifle?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the Marine's banter. The range master raised an eyebrow, but handed her an M40A5 without comment. While the others sprawled in practiced positions, adjusting scopes and discussing wind patterns, Mara settled onto the gravel with methodical precision. She arranged herself with surprising economy of movement, each adjustment deliberate and efficient. No spotter accompanied her. She requested no wind flags. The Marines nearby exchanged amused glances, a few snickering at her apparent naivety. "Ma'am, you might want some assistance with," Corporal Jesse Liang began, but fell silent as Mara loaded the rifle with practiced hands that betrayed years of muscle memory. The signal to commence firing echoed across the range. Mara's breathing slowed visibly, her shoulders relaxing rather than tensing. She took her first shot without hesitation. The crack of her rifle seemed somehow crisper than the others, more decisive. 10 shots, 10 perfect hits, center mass on each target. The instructor, checking her score, stepped back, mouth agape. He ran his hand through his cropped hair, recounting to confirm what seemed impossible. "Perfect score," he announced, disbelief evident in his voice. The range fell silent. Will Hartman moved to her position, examining her targets with narrowed eyes. The sniper instructor's jaw clenched visibly as he realized the quiet woman had outperformed his best Marines without breaking a sweat. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he demanded, his pride clearly wounded. Mara adjusted her glasses, carefully returning the borrowed weapon to its case. "The library has excellent resources," she replied simply, her eyes never meeting his. The Marines who had been joking minutes before now watched her with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. The librarian had fired with a precision that spoke of something far beyond casual practice. Each shot had been a silent rebuke to their assumptions, a perfect demonstration that skill often hides in the most unassuming packages. By sunset, whispers of the morning shooting display had reached every corner of Camp Pendleton. Marines gathered in the mess hall, their conversations punctuated with disbelief as they discussed the unassuming woman who had outshot their best. Mara A. Whitlock's name was suddenly on everyone's lips, though few could recall noticing her before she stepped onto the firing line. Gunnery Sergeant Will Hartman sat alone at the far end of the instructor's table, stabbing at his food with unusual force. The sniper instructor had built his reputation over 15 years of exemplary service, and in less than 15 minutes, a civilian librarian had made him look like an amateur. He glanced across the room where Mara sat quietly reading, seemingly oblivious to the stir she had caused. "She got lucky," he muttered to the Marine, who slid onto the bench beside him. "Wind conditions were perfect. Let's see her do that in a crosswind." Across the mess hall, Corporal Jesse Liang couldn't take his eyes off the woman. The young marksman had spent every free moment studying the techniques of legendary snipers, practicing relentlessly to earn recognition among his peers. Now this outsider had waltzed in and accomplished what had taken him years to approach. "There's no way," Jesse whispered to his squadmate. "Nobody walks in cold and shoots like that. She must have military background." His friend shrugged. "Records say she's just a librarian from Boise." "Records can be faked," Jesse replied, his voice hardening with suspicion. He watched as Mara turned a page in her book, her movements precise and economical. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. The corporal recognized those traits from his best instructors. By morning, the base was humming with theories. Some Marines suggested she must be former Special Forces. Others whispered about secret government programs. A few even joked about librarian boot camps. Major Sierra Alvarez observed the commotion from her office window, watching groups of Marines pointing toward the library skills building where the civilians were housed. The commander tapped her pen thoughtfully against a folder on her desk, a folder with Mara's name on it that contained more pages than a simple background check should have produced. Meanwhile, Will Hartman revised tomorrow's training schedule, adding a complex shooting drill that would surely expose any amateur's limitations. The sergeant wasn't about to let his reputation be undermined by some civilian fluke. As night fell over Camp Pendleton, Mara sat alone on her temporary bunk, methodically cleaning a borrowed rifle, her movements betraying years of muscle memory that no ordinary librarian should possess. She knew the storm she had created. Tomorrow would only bring more scrutiny. Gunnery Sergeant Will Hartman paced the firing line, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. The morning's events had left a bitter taste in his mouth. 20 years in the Corps, 15 as a sniper instructor, and some civilian librarian had just made his best marksmen look like amateurs. It couldn't stand. "Ms. Whitlock," he called out as Mara was packing up her borrowed rifle. "How about a little one-on-one? Just you and me?" His voice carried across the range, drawing the attention of every Marine within earshot. "Unless library work has you too tired for a real challenge." Mara adjusted her oversized glasses and regarded the instructor with a measured gaze. "What did you have in mind, Sergeant?" 10 shots, 1,000 yards, variable wind. Winner takes bragging rights." Hartman's challenge hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Word spread quickly through Camp Pendleton. By afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at the far range. Instructors, recruits, and several civilian participants from the Skills Exchange program. Ellie Navarro stood near the back, watching her new friend with concerned eyes. The rangemaster set up the targets while Hartman made a show of checking his equipment. The sniper instructor selected his personal rifle, a weapon he'd modified and perfected over years of service. Mara simply accepted the same standard-issue M40A5 she'd used earlier, inspecting it with quiet efficiency. "Ladies first," Hartman offered with a tight smile. Mara settled into position, her movements economical and precise. The crowd fell silent as she controlled her breathing, her finger finding the trigger with practiced ease. The first shot cracked across the range, followed by 9 more in a measured rhythm. When Hartman took his turn, the tension was palpable. The sergeant fired with mechanical precision, each shot accompanied by subtle adjustments for wind and distance. His face betrayed nothing, but the tightness in his shoulders told its own story. The rangemaster called a ceasefire and went to check the targets. Minutes stretched like hours until he returned with the scored paper. Whitlock, 97.8. Hartman, 97.5. 0.3 of a point. The margin was razor-thin but undeniable. Mara had won. A murmur rippled through the assembled Marines. Corporal Jesse Liang shook his head in disbelief, while others exchanged glances of grudging admiration. Hartman stood rigid, processing the defeat. Then, with military discipline, he extended his hand. "Good shooting, Miss Whitlock." "You too, Sergeant," she replied, her voice soft but steady. As the crowd dispersed, the instructor lingered, watching Mara carefully return the borrowed rifle to its case. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, curiosity replacing his earlier defensiveness. Mara glanced up, her eyes meeting his for just a moment. "Books," she said simply. "The library has excellent resources." Hartman didn't believe her for a second, but he nodded anyway. The quiet librarian from Boise had just become a lot more interesting. The darkness of Camp Pendleton's administrative building felt oppressive as Corporal Jesse Liang slipped inside, using the access card he'd borrowed from a distracted clerk. His footsteps echoed softly against the linoleum floor, each sound making him wince. The young marksman couldn't shake the humiliation of watching Mara Whitlock, a librarian for God's sake, outshoot not just him, but Gunnery Sergeant Hartman himself. "There has to be something," he muttered, navigating through dimly lit corridors toward the records room. Jesse had excelled at every marksmanship competition since enlisting. His entire identity was built around being the best shot in his unit. Now, that foundation was crumbling. The records room's lock yielded to his borrowed keycard. Inside, the glow of his smartphone illuminated rows of filing cabinets and a computer terminal in the corner. Jesse logged in using credentials he'd memorized from watching the administrator. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching first for Whitlock Mara A. Nothing appeared in the civilian contractor database. Frowning, he tried variations, eventually accessing a restricted military personnel archive. When he entered her name again, a single file appeared, heavily redacted with a bright red classified watermark. "What the hell?" Jesse whispered, leaning closer to the screen. The file contained fragments. Operation Nightshade, exceptional long-range capabilities, recommended for specialized training. Most details were blacked out, but one photo showed a younger Mara in military fatigues, standing beside three men whose faces were redacted. The date stamp indicated it was taken 7 years ago. Jesse's heart raced as he discovered another alias linked to her file, Artemis. References to this codename appeared in after-action reports from classified operations in regions he recognized from his deployment briefings. Hot zones where only the most elite units operated. A notation at the bottom of one document made his blood run cold. Asset extraction failed. Operative Whitlock D, presumed KIA. Asset Artemis withdrawn from field operations. Status, inactive reserve. Jesse sat back, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the room's chill. This quiet woman wasn't just some librarian who happened to be good with a rifle. She was something else entirely. Someone who had operated in shadows he couldn't begin to comprehend. The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted him back to reality. Quickly, Jesse logged out and slipped behind a filing cabinet as a security guard passed by the door. His mind raced with implications. The Civilian Skills Exchange Program, Mara's presence, her incredible performance, none of it was coincidental. As he made his escape through a side exit, the young Marine realized he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a wounded ego. Whatever game was being played at Camp Pendleton, Mara Whitlock was at its center, and Jesse was suddenly very afraid of what might happen next. Ellie Navarro found herself lingering after the day's training sessions, watching the quiet librarian clean her borrowed rifle with methodical precision. Unlike the others who avoided Mara after her unexpected display of skill, Ellie felt an inexplicable pull toward her. "Most people take years to develop that kind of muscle memory," Ellie remarked, settling beside Mara on the bench. The retired nurse's hands, once steady during countless surgeries, now fidgeted with the hem of her jacket. "I recognize trauma when I see it. Something happened to you before Boise, didn't it?" Mara's fingers paused momentarily on the rifle barrel before resuming their careful movements. "Libraries are peaceful," she finally answered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of Marines running drills. "Books don't judge. They don't ask questions." Over the following days, a tentative friendship formed between the two women. They found themselves sharing coffee in the early mornings before training began. Ellie's warm presence slowly chipping away at Mara's carefully constructed walls. "I treated soldiers for 27 years, Ellie confided one evening as they sat beneath the California stars, the base lights casting long shadows across the ground. "Now I volunteer at a community clinic twice a week, but it's not the same. I miss feeling essential." Mara nodded, understanding the sentiment more than she could express. Purpose is a difficult thing to replace. During their third evening together, Ellie gently pressed about what she called the accident, the unspoken event that had clearly altered the trajectory of Mara's life. The librarian stiffened, her eyes distant. "Some ghosts follow you, no matter how quietly you walk," Mara whispered, her fingers unconsciously touching the collar of her shirt where something hung beneath the fabric. Ellie didn't push further, but offered instead. "When my husband died, I cataloged our entire home library by Dewey Decimal. Grief makes us do strange things." A ghost of a smile touched Mara's lips. "I organized mine by publication date, oldest to newest. History matters." Their conversations continued, whispered exchanges after training sessions when the others had departed. For Ellie, the friendship filled the void left by retirement, a chance to care for someone again. For Mara, it offered something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, the simple comfort of being known, even if only in fragments. "We're not so different," Ellie observed one night, "both of us hiding in plain sight." Mara didn't confirm or deny this assessment, but the slight relaxation in her shoulders told Ellie everything. In a place defined by hierarchy and bravado, Their quiet alliance offered both women something rare, a moment of genuine connection amid the calculated performances required of them each day. Major Sierra Alvarez watched from the observation deck as Mara Whitlock outperformed yet another group of seasoned Marines. The base commander's eyes narrowed, not with disapproval, but recognition. She had seen that shooting stance before, years ago in a classified operation that neither woman spoke of anymore. That evening, Mara received a handwritten note requesting her presence at the commander's office. The librarian arrived precisely on time, her footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The building was nearly deserted at this hour, exactly as the major had planned. "Please, sit." Sierra gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I think we've both maintained this charade long enough, don't you?" Mara's expression remained neutral, though her fingers tensed slightly against the fabric of her faded cardigan. "I'm not sure what you mean, Major." Sierra slid a folder across the polished desk. Inside lay a photograph, Mara in tactical gear, 8 years younger, standing beside a team whose faces had been deliberately blacked out. Only the unit insignia remained visible. "Ghost Team 6, the commander said quietly. "You weren't just good, Whitlock. You were the best we had." Mara closed the folder without comment, her eyes meeting Sierra's with silent acknowledgement. "The skills exchange program wasn't random," Sierra continued. "We needed to evaluate if you still had what it takes, and clearly," she gestured toward the shooting range visible through her office window, "you do." The major leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I'm offering you a position training our covert snipers. These kids have technical skills but lack the instinct, the thing that can't be taught in standard programs, the thing you have." "I'm a librarian now," Mara replied, her voice steady despite the sudden racing of her pulse. "You can be both," Sierra countered, "but there's a condition. You'd need to officially re-enlist. No more civilian contractor status. We need you back in the system." The weight of the proposal hung between them. Mara thought of her quiet life in Boise, the predictable hours, the anonymity of moving between shelves of books where the only danger past she had tried so desperately to leave behind was no longer content to stay buried. The klaxon blared across Camp Pendleton at dawn, signaling an unscheduled exercise. Marines scrambled into position as the surprise live-fire hostage drill commenced. Gunnery Sergeant Will Hartman cursed under his breath as he examined the malfunctioning wind measurement equipment. "The digital anemometers are fried," he announced, frustration evident in his voice. "And the backup systems aren't calibrating properly." Corporal Jesse Wiang shifted nervously. Without accurate wind readings, the snipers would be shooting blind at targets positioned near the hostages, mannequins arranged 400 yards downrange. One miscalculation could mean failure. "Sir, what about Whitlock?" Jesse suggested, glancing toward Mara, who stood quietly at the edge of the group. "She might know something we don't." Hartman hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "Mara," he finally called, "got any ideas?" The librarian approached without hesitation. She surveyed the landscape, then knelt and pulled a small notebook from her pocket. "We don't need the equipment," she said softly. "Look at the grass patterns across the field. The way it bends tells us wind direction and approximate speed." The Marines exchanged skeptical glances as Mara continued, pointing to distant trees. "Those pines are swaying at approximately 3 miles per hour. Factor in the valley crosswind effect from the east." She made quick calculations in her notebook. "That's not standard protocol," Hartman objected. "It's pre-digital protocol," Mara countered. "Soviet snipers used these techniques in Afghanistan when equipment failed. It's documented in field manuals from the 80s. With no alternatives, Hartman reluctantly agreed to her approach. Mara guided the team, teaching them to read natural indicators, grass movement, dust patterns, even heat mirage shifts visible through their scopes. The exercise proceeded with Mara quietly advising each shooter on wind compensation. When Jesse's turn came, She steadied his breathing with a gentle hand on his shoulder. 3 clicks right. The wind changed direction at the halfway point. Jesse followed her instruction and hit the target perfectly. One by one, the Marines completed their shots successfully. What had begun as a potential disaster transformed into one of the most accurate drills the unit had ever performed. After the all-clear sounded, Major Sierra Alvarez approached the group. "Impressive work," she said, her eyes fixed on Mara, "especially considering the equipment failure." "Whitlock saved our asses," Hartman admitted, the acknowledgement clearly difficult for him. The librarian nodded modestly, but there was a quiet pride in her posture that hadn't been there before. As she walked away, several Marines nodded respectfully in her direction. "Where did you learn that wind-reading technique?" Jesse asked, falling into step beside her. Mara's expression remained neutral. "Books," she replied simply. "Sometimes the old ways are the most reliable." The Boise Public Library's basement held secrets that few patrons ever glimpsed. Behind a weathered door marked Archives Staff Only, Mara A. Whitlock maintained her private sanctuary. Unlike the bright open spaces upstairs where she helped children find adventure books, this underground room remained her fortress of solitude. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mara ran her fingers along the spines of countless military texts. Soviet sniper manuals from the Cold War sat beside declassified field guides from Vietnam. Each volume bore her distinctive handwriting in the margins, notes on wind calculation, breathing techniques, and position adjustments that had become second nature to her at Camp Pendleton. "Ballistics isn't just physics," she whispered to herself, reciting her father's words as she pulled down a dusty tome on long-range shooting. "It's poetry written in trajectory." The librarian had spent years building this collection, each book a piece of the puzzle that formed her expertise. Some volumes had been legally acquired through library exchanges, others had more complicated origins that she preferred not to dwell on. What mattered was the knowledge they contained, knowledge that had saved lives and, perhaps one day, might save her brother. Mara paused at a particularly worn field manual, noticing something unusual protruding from between its pages. Her heart quickened as she extracted a partially burned envelope. The paper crackled beneath her fingers, releasing the musty scent of damp paper mingled with scorched edges. Inside was a letter in handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Daniel Whitlock's distinctive scrawl, with its sharp angles and heavy pressure, brought tears to her eyes before she'd read a single word. Her brother's message was brief, cryptic, coordinates followed by a phrase from their childhood code. "Still breathing, still fighting. Look for the third tree." The words hit her like physical blows. The intelligence at Camp Pendleton hadn't been wrong. Daniel was alive. The familiar ache of his absence transformed into something sharper, more urgent. Mara clutched the paper to her chest, feeling the weight of possibilities and dangers. How had this letter found its way here? Who had delivered it? The questions multiplied as she examined the postmark, 3 months old, from a country she'd rather forget. Mara slid to the floor, surrounded by the knowledge she'd accumulated and the ghosts she couldn't escape. The quiet librarian had built this life carefully, brick by brick, shelving books and hiding in plain sight. Now those carefully constructed walls were crumbling. She folded the letter with trembling hands, tucking it into her pocket. The basement suddenly felt too small, too confined. Daniel was out there, waiting. And despite everything she'd done to disappear, to become invisible, her past refused to release its grip. The fog rolled in thick and heavy across Camp Pendleton's night range, swallowing the distant targets in its ghostly embrace. Corporal Jesse Liang had arranged this after-hours challenge with a single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. Ever since Mara A. Whitlock had outshot the Marines' best, he'd been unable to think of anything else. "Standard conditions don't prove anything," Jesse muttered, setting up his rifle with practiced movements. "Night shooting separates the lucky from the skilled." Mara simply nodded, her slender fingers methodically preparing her borrowed M40A5. The metal was cold against her skin, but her movements remained fluid and unhurried. Unlike the young marksman, who fidgeted with his scope adjustments, she seemed perfectly at ease in the darkness. 3 shots each, Jesse announced, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. Farthest target first. The night air hung heavy with moisture, distorting visibility and complicating range calculations. Jesse fired first, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his determined expression. His shots were good, excellent by most standards, but not perfect. When Mara's turn came, she took her time, breathing slowly and deliberately. Her first shot rang out, followed by 2 more in measured succession. Through his night vision equipment, Jesse could see all 3 had found their mark with unnerving precision. Lucky, he muttered, moving them to the next position. As they progressed, the fog thickened further, and the wind picked up unexpectedly. Jesse, eager to prove himself, rushed his calculations on their final position, a steep downward angle toward a ravine. The young corporal positioned himself too close to the unstable edge. "Wait," Mara cautioned, noticing the danger. "The ground isn't—" Her warning came too late. The rain-softened earth gave way beneath Jesse, sending him sliding toward a 20-foot drop. Without hesitation, Mara lunged forward, abandoning her rifle to grab his arm. For a terrifying moment, they both hung precariously over the edge. With surprising strength, the librarian pulled him to safety, her glasses askew and cardigan smeared with mud. "How did you—" Jesse began, his voice shaking slightly. "Weight distribution and leverage," she replied simply, brushing dirt from her hands. "Basic field training." They sat in silence, catching their breath as the fog swirled around them. Jesse studied her face in the dim light, seeing not the meek librarian from Boise, but someone far more complex. "You saved my life?" he finally said. Mara shrugged. "You would have done the same." Something shifted in Jesse's perception. The rivalry that had consumed him suddenly seemed childish and hollow. As they packed their equipment in companionable silence, admiration began to replace his resentment. Perhaps there was more to learn from Mara Whitlock than just how to shoot. The night air hung heavy with unspoken words, as Ellie Navarro sat beside Mara on the empty bleachers overlooking the darkened range. Most of the Marines had returned to their quarters, leaving the 2 women alone with the distant sound of crickets and the occasional far-off laughter from the barracks. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Ellie said, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the metal seat. "Back when I was still nursing at Walter Reed, I treated a soldier named Whitlock." She paused, watching Mara's face carefully. "Daniel Whitlock. I remember because he had the same unusual middle initial as yours, A." Mara's breath caught. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the bleacher. The name she had avoided speaking aloud for years now hung in the air between them. "He was my brother," she finally whispered, the admission feeling like ripping off a bandage from a wound that had never truly healed. "Daniel is everything to me." Ellie reached over, covering Mara's hand with her own. "What happened to him?" "The official report says he died during an extraction gone wrong." Mara's voice hardened, but I never believed it. There were too many inconsistencies, too many redacted lines. She looked up at the stars, as if searching for answers in their cold light. "Not knowing his fate has haunted every decision I've made since then." Across the base, Corporal Jesse Liang sat alone in the dim light of the records room, staring at the classified file he'd managed to access through connections he'd rather not explain. The words on the screen blurred before his eyes. "Whitlock, Mara A. Status inactive asset. Program Echo Silence." Jesse closed the file and rubbed his eyes. The librarian had never officially left the military. She existed in that shadowy space between civilian and operative, a designation reserved for those with skills too valuable to release completely. His earlier suspicion and rivalry now seemed childish, even dangerous. What had he done? His attempts to discredit her, to expose what he thought was a fraud, might have compromised someone who is still technically under military protection. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he realized he'd been treating a potential intelligence asset as a competitor in some petty contest. "I need to make this right," he muttered to himself, closing down the terminal. The guilt that had been building since the night shoot, when Mara had saved him from his own recklessness, deepened into something more profound, a responsibility to protect the woman who had protected him, despite his antagonism. Tomorrow, he would approach her differently, not as a rival, but as someone who understood, at least partially, the burden she carried. Jesse Liang approached the small clearing where Mara Whitlock sat cross-legged on a tarp, methodically arranging what looked like scraps of burlap, twine, and local vegetation. The morning fog still clung to Camp Pendleton's hills, creating the perfect conditions for what she'd promised to teach him. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Sorry, ma'am." The young corporal shifted uncomfortably. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been determined to expose her as a fraud. Now, he was seeking her guidance. Mara gestured to the ground beside her. "Your ghillie suit won't build itself." She handed him a mesh base. "Your father taught you this." The librarian nodded, her fingers working with practiced precision. Soviet-era techniques. He believed electronic aids would fail when you needed them most. She demonstrated how to attach the local foliage, creating a camouflage pattern that seemed to disappear against the California terrain. Over the following days, their training sessions expanded. In the early mornings, they practiced wind reading using nothing but natural indicators, grass movement, dust patterns, and heat mirages. During afternoons, they worked on analog target spotting with hand-drawn range cards. "Technology can be compromised," Mara explained while teaching Jesse how to calculate distance using only his thumb and the horizon. These methods have worked for centuries. Hartman observed their sessions from a distance, his initial resentment giving way to professional curiosity. The gunnery sergeant recognized techniques he'd only read about in obsolete field manuals, the same ones Jesse now carried, borrowed from Mara's personal collection. When the base announced the quarterly marksmanship competition, Jesse entered with quiet determination. The event drew participants from across Camp Pendleton, with Hartman serving as head judge. The young corporal applied everything he'd learned: the breathing control, the natural camouflage, the patience Mara had instilled in him. When the results were announced, Jesse stood stunned as he received the gold medal. His score had broken the previous record by 3 points. That evening, he found Mara in the mess hall, sitting alone with a cup of coffee. "I wouldn't have won without your help," he admitted, placing the medal on the table between them. She pushed it back toward him. "You earned it." "I was wrong about you," Jesse said quietly. "I was jealous, threatened." Mara offered a rare smile. Most people are when their worldview gets challenged. The corporal fingered the medal, feeling its weight. "Why help me after I tried to dig up dirt on you?" She considered this for a moment. "Because someone once taught me the same way, and because skills like these shouldn't die with their keepers." Jesse nodded, understanding that what she'd given him was more valuable than any medal. The jealousy that had once consumed him had transformed into something he hadn't expected: profound respect for the quiet librarian from Boise. The base fell silent as Mara Whitlock received the intelligence briefing in Major Alvarez's office. Her brother Daniel, presumed dead for 3 years, might be alive. The report suggested he was being held by a paramilitary group in an undisclosed location overseas. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she set down the folder, her librarian's composure cracking for the first time since her arrival at Camp Pendleton. "I need access to the complete files," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her eyes. Sierra shook her head. "Most records are sealed, Mara. Even I can't access everything. The librarian spent hours in the base's archives that night, poring over what little information was available. Document after document ended in thick black redactions, deliberate omissions that formed a wall between her and the truth about her brother. She traced her fingers over classified operation codes, searching for patterns only someone with her training might recognize. Morning found her still there, surrounded by papers, when Gunnery Sergeant Hartman appeared in the doorway. "You won't find what you need in there," Will said, his usual bravado absent. "I know because I've tried." Mara looked up, surprised by both his presence and his tone. "I trained him," the instructor continued, pulling up a chair. "Daniel was one of my best. Quick learner, steady hand. Reminded me of you, actually." The revelation hung between them as Will described the extraction mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. 3 years ago, under heavy fire, Daniel's unit had attempted to evacuate a high-value asset. Communication was lost. No bodies were recovered. "I identified what we thought were his remains," Hartman confessed, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "I wrote the letter to you myself." Mara's eyes narrowed. "You knew who I was the moment I arrived." Will nodded. "I recognized the name. Couldn't believe it was really you." For the first time, they sat together not as rivals, but as two people united by loss. The Marine described Daniel's final known coordinates, details absent from official reports, information he'd carried alone for years. "If he's alive," Mara whispered, "why hasn't he tried to contact me?" "The group holding him specializes in psychological reconditioning," Will explained. "If they have him, he might not remember who he is." Their shared grief bridged the gap that pride and competition had created. As dawn broke over Camp Pendleton, an unlikely alliance formed between the quiet librarian and the Marine instructor, both determined to uncover the truth about Daniel Whitlock, a truth that might shatter everything they thought they knew. Major Sierra Alvarez appeared at Mara's temporary quarters just after sunset, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. She closed the door behind her without asking permission, the soft click echoing with finality. "You've impressed everyone," the major said, placing a manila folder on the desk. But this was never about impressing anyone. Mara Whitlock set down the book she'd been reading, a worn copy of wind ballistics calculations, and met Alvarez's gaze. The skills exchange was a setup. "A necessary evaluation," Alvarez corrected. "Your reactivation papers were processed 3 weeks ago. The Pentagon doesn't consider you retired, just on extended leave." The words hung in the air between them. Mara's fingers tightened around the spine of her book, knuckles whitening. "I have a life in Boise," she said quietly. "Patrons who depend on me, books that need cataloging." The major's laugh was short and without humor. "You organize tactical manuals in your basement and maintain a shooting schedule that would exhaust most active-duty Marines. That's not retirement, Mara. That's waiting." Alvarez opened the folder, revealing satellite images of a compound in terrain Mara recognized instantly. Her heart stuttered. "Daniel," she whispered, "we have confirmation, 98% facial recognition match from 3 separate intelligence sources." Mara stood and moved to the window, watching Marines crossing the parade ground in the distance. The life she'd carefully constructed, the quiet hours among shelves, the predictable rhythm of the library, suddenly felt like a thin disguise she'd been wearing for years. "I can't just disappear from my job," she argued, though her voice lacked conviction. "Your director received paperwork for an extended research sabbatical this morning. Everything's arranged." Of course it was. The military machine moved with ruthless efficiency when it wanted something. "And if I refuse?" Mara asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we send someone else. Someone who doesn't know Daniel like you do. Someone who might not recognize when to pull the trigger and when not to." The implication was clear. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her brother's dog tag against her skin. hidden beneath her shirt. The obligation she felt toward Daniel had never diminished, merely been pushed aside while she pretended at normalcy. "How long?" she asked finally. "Wheels up at 0600. Pack light." After Alvarez left, Mara sat on the edge of her bed, caught between two lives, the peaceful existence she'd created and the duty that had never truly released her. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to the Boise Public Library's number, wondering what words could possibly explain the absence she now faced. The quiet librarian was disappearing again, and this time she wasn't sure she would return. The sky opened with a vengeance over Camp Pendleton as the final day of the joint sniper competition began. Marines, NATO allies, and one unassuming librarian huddled under makeshift shelters, their faces illuminated by occasional lightning flashes. Rain hammered the metal roofs, creating a chaotic percussion that matched Mara A. Whitlock's heartbeat as she methodically prepared her borrowed rifle. "Weather's going to separate the real shooters from the pretenders," muttered Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, glancing at Mara with newfound respect. She nodded silently, her fingers working with practiced precision as she cleaned each component of the standard-issue weapon. The competition course had been transformed by the deluge, targets barely visible through sheets of rain, distances distorted by the downpour, and wind patterns unpredictable. Perfect conditions to test adaptability, something Mara had mastered long before setting foot on this base. When her turn came, the librarian settled into position, her body forming a perfect triangle with the ground. Unlike the others who relied heavily on modern rangefinders and digital wind meters, Mara observed the way raindrops fell at different angles across the field. She watched how the tall grass bent in patterns, revealing invisible air currents that the electronic devices couldn't detect. "What's she doing?" Jessie whispered to Ellie, who stood nearby under an umbrella. "Watching the rain," the retired nurse replied. Her father taught her to read nature instead of instruments. Mara's first shot rang out, finding its mark with unerring precision. Then another, and another. Each bullet seemed to navigate the storm as if guided by an unseen hand. She employed techniques forgotten by modern military doctrine, methods passed down from her father, who had learned them from old Soviet manuals during the Cold War. The scoreboard, updated after each round, showed what many had thought impossible. The quiet woman from Boise had outshot decorated Marines and international specialists alike. Her score stood alone at the top, untouchable even by Hartman himself. Major Alvarez watched from beneath the command tent, her expression unreadable. This public display of skill had accomplished exactly what she'd intended, proving beyond doubt that Mara's talents were exceptional and necessary. As the competition concluded, the rain subsided to a gentle patter. Marines approached Mara with handshakes and questions, their earlier skepticism washed away by the storm and her performance. Even Jessie approached with genuine admiration, no trace of his former jealousy remaining. "Where did you learn to shoot like that in these conditions?" he asked. Mara carefully disassembled the rifle, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. "Some lessons," she said quietly, "you learn long before you ever pick up a weapon." The intelligence briefing hit Mara Whitlock like a physical blow. Daniel, her brother, her childhood protector, was alive. The grainy surveillance photos spread across Major Alvarez's desk showed a man with hollow eyes and a rigid posture that seemed both familiar and foreign. He had been captured 3 years ago, subjected to extensive psychological conditioning, and now worked as a precision shooter for the very group they were tracking. "He's been compromised," Alvarez explained, her voice clinical but eyes watchful. "Standard extraction protocols won't work. He's been programmed to view rescue attempts as threats." Mara's fingers traced the outline of her brother's face in the photograph. "He would recognize me," she whispered. "Not anymore," the major countered. "His handlers have erased much of his personal history." The room fell silent as Mara processed this information. Then, something sparked in her memory. Summer evenings in Idaho, flashlights under blanket forts, and the elaborate tap and whistle code they had invented. A language only siblings could understand. Derived from their father's military signals and their mother's piano lessons. There might be a way, she said finally. Something buried too deep for them to erase. Back in her temporary quarters, Mara pulled out her rifle case and began methodically preparing her equipment. This wouldn't be about killing or even capturing. At 1,000 meters, she would need to communicate through the only medium that made sense. Precision shooting in a pattern only Daniel would recognize as deliberate. Jesse Liang found her at the range that evening, practicing what looked like intentional misses. "What are you doing?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. The librarian didn't look up from her scope. "Creating a conversation." She explained how she and Daniel had developed their code. 3 shots high meant danger, 2 shots wide meant retreat, and specific patterns represented letters and phrases. It was childish, elaborate, and utterly unique to them. "If anything remains of my brother in there," Mara said, "this will reach him." Hartman joined them later, offering tactical support for what everyone recognized as a desperate gamble. "Your brother was one of the best I ever trained," the gunnery sergeant admitted. "If anyone could resist that kind of conditioning, it would be him." As dawn approached, Mara packed away her rifle, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. The weight of tomorrow's encounter pressed down on her, the possibility of reaching Daniel, balanced against the risk of failure. She might have only one chance to speak to him through bullet trajectories and impact patterns before his handlers realized what was happening. "I've spent years hiding who I am," she told Ellie over a late-night call. "Now I have to hope he remembers who we were." Mara A. Whitlock sat alone in her temporary quarters at Camp Pendleton, surrounded by papers and classified documents Major Sierra Alvarez had reluctantly provided. The librarian's fingers traced redacted lines of text, searching for gaps in the black ink that might reveal Daniel's location. Legal barriers stood like walls between her and her brother. International jurisdiction issues, classified operations protocols, and the diplomatic minefield of unauthorized extraction missions. "They've buried him in paperwork," she whispered to herself, organizing the files with the same methodical precision she used for shelving books. The woman who had once disappeared so effectively into civilian life now found herself visible again, painfully so. Marines nodded respectfully when she passed, some even saluting despite her civilian status. Her performance at the range had traveled beyond Camp Pendleton. 3 private military contractors had left messages requesting meetings, and a government agency had sent a discreet job offer to her Boise address. Ellie knocked softly before entering with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept," the retired nurse said, placing one steaming cup beside the scattered papers. "I can't afford to," Mara replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "Every day Daniel spends with them, I lose more of him." Her phone buzzed with another unknown number, the 5th that day. Mara silenced it without looking. The quiet anonymity she had cultivated in Boise was unraveling thread by thread. Her carefully constructed identity as just another librarian had been compromised the moment she fired that first perfect shot. Gunny Hartman entered without ceremony, his expression grim. "We have a situation. Someone leaked footage of your shooting demonstration online. Over 2 million views already." Mara closed her eyes, feeling the last vestiges of her private life slipping away. The sergeant placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "I've spent 9 years becoming invisible," she said quietly. "Now I have to decide if saving Daniel is worth becoming visible again." Jesse Liang appeared in the doorway, holding a tablet. "I might have something," the young marksman said. "There's a pattern in these deployment records. If Daniel's captors are following their usual rotation." Mara looked at the faces around her. The Marine who had once resented her, the corporal who had tried to expose her, the nurse who had become her friend. The weight of their support stood in stark contrast to the isolation she had chosen for herself in Boise. "If I do this," she said finally, "there's no going back to shelving books and living quietly." Hartman nodded. "Some people aren't meant to stay hidden, Whitlock. Some skills come with responsibility." Mara gathered the papers, her decision crystallizing. The library would have to find another quiet employee. The woman who could outshoot every Marine sniper had a different path to follow now. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above as Mara A. Whitlock moved between the empty stacks of the Boise Public Library. The building had closed hours ago, but she'd kept her keycard privileges for late nights like this one. After a grueling day at Camp Pendleton, the familiar smell of aged paper and binding glue should have been comforting. Tonight, it wasn't enough. She slumped into her chair in the reference section, her fingers trembling as they reached for the bottom drawer of her desk. The metal dog tag lay nestled in a small velvet pouch, its edges worn smooth from years of worried touches. Mara traced the embossed letters of her brother's name, the cool metal warming against her skin. Daniel's presence, even just in this small token, broke through the careful walls she'd built. The first tear fell silently, then another. Soon her shoulders shook with quiet sobs that echoed in the empty building. The woman who had outshot decorated Marines, who had maintained perfect composure under the scrutiny of military brass, finally crumbled when no one was watching. She pressed the dog tag to her lips, whispering apologies to a brother who might never hear them. "I thought I might find you here," a gentle voice called from the doorway. Mara hastily wiped her eyes, but Ellie Navarro had already seen. The retired nurse crossed the room with purpose, pulling up a chair beside her friend. "You don't need to hide from me," Ellie said, her weathered hands reaching for Mara's. "Not after everything." The librarian's defenses wavered. "I can't afford weakness. Not now." "This isn't weakness," Ellie countered, gently taking the dog tag and placing it on the desk. She reached into her bag for a small brush and began to run it through Mara's tangled hair with smooth, maternal strokes. "This is being human." Each gentle pass of the brush loosened something in Mara closed her eyes, surrendering to the comfort. "What if I've already broken?" "Then we forge you anew," the nurse replied, her fingers working through a stubborn knot. "Your strength isn't in never showing pain. It's in continuing despite it." Outside, rain began to patter against the library windows, creating a soft percussion to accompany their shared silence. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Mara allowed herself to be tended to be seen not as a weapon or a wonder, but simply as a woman carrying an impossible weight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Ellie simply nodded, continuing to brush as the storm outside gathered strength. The Marines lined the pathway as Mara A. Whitlock departed Camp Pendleton. Her once pristine boots were caked with mud, and the weathered rifle case swung gently at her side. She walked with quiet dignity, her shoulders straight despite the weight of all that had transpired. Some of the higher-ranking officers offered crisp salutes as she passed, while others simply watched in reverent silence. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a civilian who had not only matched their elite skills, but had redefined what mastery looked like. Gunnery Sergeant Hartman stood at attention near the gate. When Mara approached, he extended his hand. "The Corps won't forget what you showed us," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. The librarian nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing her face as she shook his hand. Their shared grief over Daniel had forged an unexpected bond. Jesse Liang waited at the perimeter, his medal gleaming on his uniform. The young marksman had transformed from her fiercest rival to her most dedicated student. "I'll keep practicing those wind-reading techniques," he promised, his eyes reflecting both admiration and sadness at her departure. Ellie embraced her friend tightly. "The library will be lucky to have you back," the retired nurse whispered. "But remember what I said. You don't always have to be steel. Mara squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. Major Alvarez watched from her office window, her expression unreadable. The base commander had orchestrated this entire program to bring Mara back into the fold. Yet something in her eyes suggested respect for the librarian's choice to walk away. 3 weeks later, Mara was back among the stacks at Boise Public Library. She moved through the quiet aisles, shelving books with methodical precision. Her colleagues noticed nothing different about her, just the same unassuming woman who had taken a brief leave of absence. None suspected the legends now whispered about her at Camp Pendleton, or the skills she had demonstrated there. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows as Mara organized the reference section. Her fingers traced the spines of military histories, many containing her own annotations in the margins. The monotony of library work brought comfort after the intensity of the training grounds. When she returned to the circulation desk, a small package waited. The worn envelope bore no return address, but the wax seal pressed with her old unit's insignia made her breath catch. Inside lay a single sheet of paper with coordinates and 5 words that shattered her carefully reconstructed piece. One last shot. He's waiting. Mara's hand trembled only for a moment before steadying. Daniel was alive. Her brother needed her. And despite everything she'd done to disappear into the quiet life she'd built, she knew her journey was far from over. Mara A. Whitlock turned the sign on the library door to closed and locked it with practiced efficiency. The familiar weight of her rifle case felt right in her hands after so many years of pretending it wasn't part of her. She ran her fingers over the weathered leather, remembering every mission, every shot, every moment that had led to this. The coordinates in the envelope pointed to a remote location in the mountains. She had memorized them instantly, burning the paper afterward, old habits from a life she had tried to leave behind. The note's handwriting wasn't Daniel's, but the message was clear enough. Her brother was waiting, and this might be her only chance. In the staff bathroom, Mara changed from her cardigan and sensible shoes into tactical gear hidden in her locker for months. The transformation was more than physical. With each item, the librarian receded, and the operator emerged. Her movements became more deliberate, her gaze sharper, her breathing controlled. She called Ellie before leaving. "If I'm not back in 3 days, there's a letter in my desk drawer. You'll know what to do." The retired nurse had become more than a friend. She was the only civilian who had seen beyond Mara's carefully constructed facade. Outside, Boise continued its evening routines, oblivious to the woman walking among them with a rifle case and a mission. Families headed home for dinner, students hunched over laptops in coffee shops, and couples strolled hand in hand. Normal lives that Mara had mimicked but never truly lived. Her vehicle waited in the back lot, nondescript, reliable, and modified in ways invisible to casual observers. As she loaded her equipment, her phone buzzed with a message from Jesse. "Whatever happens, remember what you taught me. Wind is the enemy, patience is the weapon." The young Marine had grown beyond his jealousy, becoming both student and ally. Hartman had sent his own message earlier. Coordinates for a secondary extraction point and a single word, Godspeed. The gunnery sergeant understood what she faced better than anyone. He had trained Daniel, after all, before everything went wrong. As Mara pulled away from the library, she glanced at the building that had sheltered her for years. The quiet stacks had been her refuge, but they had also been her prison, a place to hide from who she truly was. The road ahead would lead her to Daniel, to answers, and perhaps to an end. Major Alvarez had been right all along. Some skills couldn't be buried under call numbers and card catalogs. Some people couldn't escape their true nature, no matter how many books they shelved. Mara's hands were steady on the wheel, her mind already calculating trajectories, wind patterns, and contingencies. The quiet was over. The last shot was coming, and this time it would change everything.